The very essence of the mental game is this. The only reason an event matters is because we make it matter.
Welcome to the Mullins Farrier Podcast, where I will sit down and converse with the superstars, the overachievers, the masters of our craft. Each episode will be a deep dive into their personal philosophies, their habits, the tools they use, and the secrets to not only their success, but overcoming failure as well.
First, find somebody you can mimic, then find somebody you can stand, and then try to focus on one style until you master that style.
So if you say I can't do something, well, you're absolutely right. But if you say you're going to, you're absolutely right with that too.
People say that you shouldn't define yourself by your work. That is not true.
You know what Dave Farley does when he's, lucky enough to be at the World Equestrian Games? I'm watching other people work.
Yeah.
I don't think we do that enough.
This podcast is for all of you out there who share my passion for the job and the desire to always improve. These interviews will put you in touch with the inner workings of the role models we all want to emulate. So let's get to it.
There's only so many hours in a day, and it's a matter of what you do with them.
Welcome to the Mullins Farrier Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Andrew DeVisser CJF. You will notice that the podcast has been pretty heavy on the Canadian side for the last few episodes. I promise that as I start to travel more, once winter comes, there will be more American interviews and some international guests as well. But for now, I'm staying within my neighborhood. The very fortunate thing about where I get to work is that it has a very high population of horses within a fairly small area. I don't know what the current stats are, but I have heard that at one point we had more horses in Ontario than they do in Kentucky, which is very hard to believe. We have several tracks, several showgrounds. Basically, every discipline is represented here in Ontario by an association and by many venues in which to show. So because of that, we are very fortunate to also have a very good selection of good farriers. This podcast gives me an excuse to hang out with them, learn some lessons off of them and share those with you, and let them share their stories with you too. Back to Andrew. So I will read you Andrew's bio. This is written in his own words. Andrew DeVisser is a farrier from Paris, Ontario. He shoes primarily hunter jumpers, along with a healthy dose of field hunters and eventing horses. Andrew has been shoeing for 10.5 years. He attended Butler Professional Farrier School and served in an apprenticeship under Leo Chapman of Milton, Ontario. He has always worked towards improving his skills through competition and also saw certification as a means to that end. Through a lot of hard work, he was able to pass his CJF at the age of 23. Andrew continues to compete as time allows with 4 kids at home and has taken a special interest in the business side of shoeing horses as well. He loves shoeing horses and feels fortunate to be able to do it for a living. I was fortunate to spend the day with Andrew. We went out on sort of a short run day and got to discuss all kinds of shoeing theory and practices. I had a great time, and it allowed me to sort of change the trajectory of some of the questions that I was going to ask him. So I'm very excited for you guys to hear this. Please enjoy my interview with Andrew DeVisser. Let's get to it. So I'm sitting here today with Andrew DeVisser. We just spent a day hanging out together while he tended to some of his clients. So we're just sitting in his shop. Please excuse the nature sounds in the background. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this today. This is great. The first time, actually, I think we figured out today it was the second time I met you, was at a shoeing competition near Guelph, Ontario, many years ago. And there was an eagle eye class, and you had done a hind shoe for it. The shoe fell right onto the foot that they had set out for us. And I remember looking at that shape, and up until that point, I hadn't seen a shoe look like that before. It was a perfectly shaped hind foot, and the shoe perfectly matched the foot itself. It took several years and some school to figure out later. I was always used to just a blunt toe and lots of expansion in the heels. It wasn't until much later that I really learned how to shape to a toe and shape to a whole foot leading from that. I wanted to start today with the question, how did you achieve such a high level of skill so early in your career?
I think there were two things. Number one was having a good mentor. The person that you work with the most is the person you're going to strive to emulate. And that's the kind of standard that you're going to be shooting for. And I think the second thing is lots of practice. That's really what it comes down to. There's no shortcut to getting practice.
For sure. What were your early stages of education in this?
So I started off with apprenticeship, and I apprenticed for a couple of months, and then I went to school for 6 weeks to get some of the foundations, and then back to apprenticing. And on top of that, just sprinkled through the apprenticeship were lots of clinics and competitions, as well as working with a couple of other people, and a lot of reading as well. If I had a problem I encountered during the day, I would talk to people, I would read up on it. So a combination of a whole bunch of different things, yeah.
So what inspired you to become a shoer in the first place?
It took me a long time. When I came into grade 12 in high school, I had not the foggiest idea of what I wanted to do. I had a couple of career opportunities that were open to me. I could have been an engineer, I think like probably most of the rest of my family. I worked as a land surveyor straight out of high school, so I was considering doing that as a career. But there wasn't really anything that I completely fell in love with. I looked into so many careers, and all of them ended up being kind of the same for me in that it just didn't really seem to be a good fit. A lot of things I probably could have done, but I continue looking, There was nothing that I really stuck with per se, only things that I probably would have ended up settling for. So I had always worked with horses from kind of the age of 12 or 13, working in a horse farm, mucking stalls and that sort of thing. And the man I ended up apprenticing under, he also did the horses in that barn. So that was my first exposure to farriery as a craft. And I remember asking questions about how he got into it, about his apprenticeship and that sort of thing. There were two friends of mine who are still shoeing horses now, Anthony Daly and Paul Bowling, and who I'm sure many of you will know. And I went out and worked with both of those guys for a day or a couple of days, and they put me under some horses, and it was the career equivalent of love at first sight. So from the very first time I was under horses, I loved it. I remember it was the middle of winter and I was sweating like the dickens, but I loved it. So I went back to that farm and I pestered that guy for a job, and that's how it all started. Yeah.
Oh, incredible. So what were some of the key lessons that you learned right off the bat working with Leo? What are some key takeaways you got from him?
I think starting with a really good, solid foundation, especially in terms of trim and fit. Leo is really handy, really good at overcoming problems, but everything was built off of a solid trim and a solid fit, and that's where if that wasn't good, then nothing was going to be good. I think that was one of the big things that Leo really stressed.
So what form did your apprenticeship take working with Leo?
So I worked with Leo. Initially, I was going along with him 5 days a week, and then as much as I could, just kind of sprinkled throughout. I would work with other guys, but Leo was kind of the main one. I worked with him a total of 8 years, starting out 5 days a week. And then as my own clientele grew and I did a bit of work for some others, dropping down to 2 and then eventually to 1 day a week. Yeah, so like I say, full-time at the start, and kind of as my own clientele grew, then I just kind of dropped off. As we were talking about earlier today, as I started to gain my own clientele, I started to ask much better questions. So I was really glad to have that day a week where I could sit in the truck with Leo and ask him questions about different problems I was encountering in my own clientele, and that was a huge asset. I think in that sense, at the beginning, you learn all the foundational skills, but it takes on a whole new dimension when they're your own horses. And there's a whole different set of problems that come along with it, many of which you've never seen before. So that was a huge value to have somebody who I could rely on for help, who I was seeing on the weekly, who had a lot of these answers that I really didn't.
For sure. There is always going to be something that comes up that you haven't experienced yet. And just having that knowledgeable person who's probably been there and seen it maybe more than once, it's great to have that as a backup.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Was it through Leo that you started competing?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Leo was on the Canadian Farriers team multiple times. And so he walked me through making my first shoe. probably, I would say in the early years, the majority of what I learned about building shoes and shaping shoes was from him. He gave me a lot of lessons, and I would show him all the shoes I was making at home. I would take them along with me to work, and he would critique them and show me where I could improve, and often actually, throw a piece of steel in the fire or throw a shoe in the fire and physically show me sometimes when I needed it. That's definitely how I started. And then I talked to a bunch of other people, who are building shoes and competing, and you kind of get bitten by the bug a little bit, I think, right? So
for sure.
Yeah.
As you were coming up and practicing, how much time do you think you dedicated to that?
In the early years, it was usually between an hour and 2 hours per day. In the last years, it's been a bit more sporadic. I try to forge some every day. So it's still on a busy day, time dedicated building shoes, mostly now for horses, but it can reach about an hour a day still, depending on what the day looks like, if it's a heavy day. Practicing for competitions is a bit more sporadic but dedicated. So I'll usually try to have a couple of days a week where I'm in the forge for 2 hours a night, kind of a thing. Maybe do that 2 or 3 days per week while I'm gearing up, a couple of months before a competition. And then obviously it'll be a lot less in between contests. But yeah, in the early years, it was quite consistent, an hour or two per day.
Okay. And then you eventually found yourself in England with the exchange program that some of you will be familiar with from Sarah's interview. How did that happen?
Yeah, so it was partly through talking to Sarah and other people that had done it. Leo had actually done the cultural exchange, but to the United States many years ago. And so it was just mostly through talking with people who had done it in the past. It sounded like a really good opportunity, a time of really condensed and intensive learning.
No kidding.
And the opportunity to work with some really good people. So after talking with some of those people, I eventually started talking to some of the different people who run the cultural exchange. That's kind of how I got started on going down that path.
Okay. Who are some of the people that you worked with over there?
I went along with Hugh Dyer, he kind of heads up the cultural exchange on that end. And his house is kind of home base for whoever goes there. So from his place, you'll kind of leave and then come back several times.
Okay.
So I worked with him kind of on and off. I started there, I finished there, and I was there a little bit in between. I worked with Jake and Martin Elliott, who are out in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, around there, and very talented shoers. After that, I worked with Derek Gardner, which was a really neat experience. Derek is a very, very talented horseshoer. He's very precise in the way that he works. Watching him use a rasp, I never thought a rasp could be used with that much precision. But you watch him use a rasp, it's like watching a mill work or a machine, a lathe or something like. He's very accurate, very precise with his tools. And he takes very good care of the feet, very good attention to detail. It doesn't matter if the horse came out of knee-deep mud or if it was in a big fancy barn. He kind of shoes them all, to the same standard, the same level. So it was really neat. And the other cool thing about working with Derek was that he does a lot of tool making, which was an interest of mine as well. So Derek's tools are top notch.
I agree.
Yeah. I was fortunate enough to take some of his tools home with me, which was pretty cool. So
Okay.
I still use them every day. Yep. After working with him, I worked with John Atkinson, another tool maker. I went out with him for just a day, and that was really neat. I learned a lot. I worked with Billy Crothers as well for about, I think, the better part of a week. That was really neat. One interesting thing about working with Billy is that he has a really interesting system for shoeing horses quickly with a lot of people. His system essentially boils down to people working on pairs of feet at a time. So everybody works to the maximum of their skill level. If you're a junior apprentice, then you're obviously only going to be pulling and clinching. If you're a senior apprentice, you're going to be doing a lot more trimming and nailing. And Billy himself would do a lot of the shaping because he was the fastest at that, shaping and grinding.
Right.
So I would go pull 2 shoes and then trim the front feet. And then Billy would shape the shoes up. And while he was doing that, I would be off trimming another pair of feet. And then I would go somewhere else to another horse and clinch the feet. So it was this big pattern of people zigzagging all over the place. But everybody was busy all the time and working at their maximum potential. So it was a very fast and accurate way of shoeing a lot of horses well in a short period of time.
No kidding.
Yeah.
What were some of the differences that you found between shoeing there and shoeing here?
One of the big differences was the weather and facilities. So what I mean by that is in North America, we often don't know how good we have it. We really don't. I can count on one hand the number of times I shot horses under a roof in the UK.
Really?
Yeah. And it's raining all the time, even from that aspect, we complain a little bit when we get mud on our hands, but their tools are getting wet all the time, you know?
Yeah.
On top of that, because of the weather, they're very good at dealing with wet feet. I think there were a couple of good lessons that I learned from seeing that, from managing wet feet. They know not to be super aggressive with the really wet feet. They can only handle so much, you know, in terms of dressing flare and backing them up. They shoe a lot of field hunters and use a lot of concave, more so than here. And so for myself, I also shoe primarily with concave, depending on the discipline, but I use a lot of it in my clientele. Having a lot of concave being used and handmade there, I learned a lot of that. But even for those who use kegs, there's still a long history of these handmade shoes, especially with the concave. Even for those who primarily use kegs over there, they still utilize a lot more of the principles from hand making shoes, and they bring that into their everyday shoeing a lot more. So the forging skills, they really bring that into play. There were a lot of shoeing jobs that here, I think probably a lot of us would have used a lot more modern materials, but they were able to solve problems kind of the good old fashioned way in a sense. Yeah. They had maybe a more simple approach, if you will, but because of the high level of forging skill with just a piece of steel, they were able to overcome a lot of problems.
A lot less packages and pads. And
I would say so.
Like that.
Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the benefits that you have found in using concave?
So concave is a really neat section. The concave inner rim allows them to shed that puck of dirt, you know, so it's not completely flat across the bottom of the foot if they're in an area where the dirt tends to pack in. So that's especially important for something like field hunters or anyone that needs traction in dirt or soft footing. That continuous fuller all the way around gives a good amount of traction, a higher level than flat steel on any surface, but especially even on hard surfaces like asphalt or concrete. Clients have noticed actually a fairly noticeable difference compared to flat steel. It's a very strong section for its weight. So, you know, a 3/8 by 3/4, it's only just over half the weight of solid 3/8 by 3/4 flat bar, but it's a very strong section for the weight. So yeah, those are just a couple of benefits off the hop. It's very versatile, but it gives good traction without being overly grabby. You know, it's a good all around section for a lot of things.
Okay. And you use it often. I know you, I think, exclusively use handmaids in your practice, right?
Yeah, I try to, yeah. I use some kegs that are given to me, but yeah, that's about it.
Okay. And what are the benefits you found? Like, why did you make that decision to stick with the handmaids?
It actually started, I think it might have been the first time that we met. I believe Chris Gregory was judging that contest. And I remember sitting with him at dinner time. And he, if I'm not mistaken, he got his Journeyman at age 23 or 24. And I asked him how in the world he had done that, because it's a very young age to get it. And he said, well, he was shoeing a whole bunch of horses, 5 to 10 horses per day, and he went to all handmaids. And so at the time, I thought to myself, well, I'm not shoeing that many horses, but I can sure go to all handmade shoes. So I did. And that was the initial push to do it, was to prepare for my Journeyman. And it made sense just from an economical standpoint, you know, being young, kind of getting started. And I had planned to switch to kegs, but over time, and I think partly because the skill in hand making shoes has gone up as well as I've done it for longer, but I find I'm noticing a bigger and bigger difference just in terms of the alterability of handmaids versus kegs. I guess more in terms of a keg shoe is made in one way, where a handmade shoe, you can make them the same size shoe for a very specific purpose, for a very specific foot. So everything from the pitch of the nails to the nail placement, you know, all of these things are meant for that foot. And it's a lot of little differences that you can easily overlook, but little differences add up to make big differences in the quality and the strength of feet. So I found that on probably, I would say 60% of the horses in my clientele, they're all fairly straightforward, but especially that 1/3 really, really benefits from having a shoe that's custom made for it. I would say also that the economical standpoint is still a factor. I'd be lying if I didn't.
Right.
I bought the steel, a lot of the steel that I still use in a big batch. So it is fairly economical to make it, and it just keeps you sharp, keeps your forging skills up.
Right. There are some people who, the argument that's been put to me quite often is just how much time you spend making handmade shoes. Could you explain what the process is? You don't build many at the foot, right? You often pick a night or a day and pre-make some, right? for your
Yeah, that's correct.
business?
So my ideal way of doing it is to have handmade kegs in the truck. So I make them in 1/4-inch increments. I cut steel in 1/4-inch increments. In a perfect world, I would always have all the sizes I need. Now, I would say that since I'm still building them, I'd probably be building about 1/3 or so at the horse, still because I find that 1/3. What happens in actual reality is that towards the end of the summer, I get behind and I end up building probably 90% of them at the horse.
Okay.
So if you look at my shoe rack, it's pretty empty right now. But in terms of time, it's not really that crazy. I find compared to most keg shoes are 5/16, not 3/8. Most of the steel I nail on is 3/8. So I get on average at least 3 to 4 resets after the initial shoeing.
Oh, really?
So my shoes are on, and it's partly my clientele and partly a lot of them live in soft footing. So that helps a lot, but I am getting a lot of resets out of them. So that means I'm making less shoes.
For sure.
I find that putting the steel where it needs to be, if a horse is going to wear it down quickly, there's not a weedy toe to contend with. So that helps. But in terms of the actual time, even making them at the horse, for as long as the pair of shoes isn't too big, usually I find it adds maybe 8 to 10 minutes. And if it is something really weird or wonderful that's going to take a long time, I will put the horse in a stall, just so they're not there pawing and they can relax.
Right.
But I find if I'm making new shoes, it's not a huge noticeable difference over altering a keg shoe that needs to be significantly altered. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess one thing I could add to that, if I make shoes in the shop unclipped, you can usually make about 6 pairs an hour if they're, unclipped. And I find that I could do that maybe once a week at a maximum, usually once every other week, and that'll get me through. That's enough.
Now, as somebody who mainly uses the concave and handmaids, do you find on those rare times that you do use keg shoes that you have to do a lot more to them to get them kind of in the shape and form that you want them to put them on the foot?
I would say so, yeah. On a straightforward, nice foot, no, I think keg shoes have gotten a lot better. The nail placement and fit is a lot better. So on a straightforward foot, no, there's a lot of kegs go on really nicely, But when you get those wonky feet, especially ones that really need a lot of modification, yeah, sometimes I've modified some kegs and I think, I should have just built a shoe. It'd be quicker and easier, right?
Right.
Sometimes all the work. So there are definitely times for sure.
So what are some of the most common modifications you find you have to make for that third of your horses that require something different?
I would say with the handmaids, it's not so much of a modification, it's just stuff that's built into the shoe from the get-go. So nail placement or nail pitch, excessive nail pitch on a really low angled horse, that kind of thing. So you can get the nails where they're supposed to be. Building some breakover, like really heavily rolling that toe. On the concave, it works really nice if you can, because you can kind of fold the section over so you can really aggressively roll a toe.
Right.
And still maintain that structural integrity in the toe. If a foot has a whole bunch of offset to it, when you're building a shoe, you can build that right into the shoe and it'll fit that foot really nicely. So those are just some of the things. When you get some of those wonky feet, you can really accommodate them well. Symmetry is a good thing and there is safety in symmetry. But when you get a foot that's really asymmetrical and you try to nail on a perfectly symmetrical shoe, it doesn't work very well, does it? Right.
No.
So accommodating that, I find it gives you more leeway in terms of being able to accommodate just building those things into the shoe.
For sure.
Yeah.
When you started out on your own, what were some of the key lessons that you picked up as you went? Maybe some things that you didn't quite learn in your apprenticeship that popped up once you were out on your own.
There were a couple of things. When you start, there's no question about it. I think it's true across the board. You work on some bad horses, right? It's just the way it goes. So when I was working on some bad horses, I learned to prioritize the elements of the trim. So some horses, they were really on a timer. And you have to think, if I can only get this foot up, if I can only keep it up for 30 seconds or 30 seconds at a time, what do I have to get done? So if the horse has a really long toe and the sole is okay, it just kind of looks a little bit ugly, and the frog's okay, but it's a little ratty, the first thing I would do is knock the toe off. If that's all I can get done, that's at least going to help this horse out functionally. And then after that, move on to making it the things that are only going to make it marginally more functional, but quite a bit more pretty, right? So
yeah.
I think one of the things it taught me was to learn when to ask for help, because I got into a few situations where I was asked to come and fix some horses. It was fortunate that they were old and kind of geriatric horses with a multitude of problems. And thankfully, you could almost do no wrong because they were so overdue. But some of them were also quite beyond my skill level in a sense. So I learned to ask help for those types of situations, which was really good to learn my limitations as well. Yeah.
Right. At any point in your career, have you had an experience that at the time seemed to be a really bad, a really negative experience that with time you kind of discovered was actually a good one?
I think, to be honest, every experience that seemed negative at the time has been, at the minimum, a learning experience. So positive experiences are very wonderful, but they don't always teach you very much. It's kind of like the difference between a compliment and a criticism. If someone compliments you on a shoe you just made, that's wonderful, but you don't learn anything. If they critique you, you feel a little less wonderful about yourself, but you learn something. So
you get better. Yeah.
In that sense, most of the experiences I've had that were negative experiences in shoeing horses, I learned a lesson. It was really driven home. That'd be about the size of it for that one.
Well, in the experience of driving around with you today, I picked up a bunch of stuff, including what you just spoke of there. Now, you said you've traveled around with a few people recently. Are there any lessons that you've picked up there that you hadn't maybe thought of before that you found you've kind of embraced into your practice?
Yeah, certainly. One of them would be that a lot of the things that we tend to think of as being hard and fast rules, sometimes people, when they're shoeing horses, they break those things that we always consider to be hard and fast rules, but it really seems to hold the feet together really well. It seems to work for some horses. And I think part of that is maybe not so much that they're breaking the rules, is that they have a unique application, a unique way that they're trimming or a unique way that they're fitting up shoes. And so I think, as we were talking about earlier today, I went through a few pendulum swings of clips. At first I was side clipping everything, and then I was toe clipping and anti-side clip. And now I'm kind of learning as I'm riding around with a lot of people that some of the best horseshoers that I know, they almost become transcendent of any one style. They almost become not just a blend of all of the styles per se, but they kind of learn to be adaptive and flexible. And I would say that's one thing Leo was really good at as well, being very adaptive and not stuck in a rut, being good to whatever the situation needs, that's what's going on. So if side clips are best for this foot, then that's what's going on. And same thing with toe clips, quarter clips, horse needs pads, doesn't need pads, whatever, that sort of thing. But that's one of the big takeaways from working with different people, is learning to be flexible and to be always building into your knowledge base of the different styles, of the different building blocks that you can then adapt to whatever the situation will necessitate.
For sure. So when you were anti-side clip, what was your aversion to them? And then what do you think has changed that? Why do you think you could embrace it maybe again?
I think that for a lot of the feet that I see, the shape is not very conducive or necessary. Part of my aversion to it was probably I was seeing a lot of poor application to it, if I'm being honest. But I do find that when improperly applied, I know this is somewhat debated, but I do find that they tend to clamp the foot up, in trying to get away from that. And also that when you set a side clip shoe back, it's easy to set it back far, and it's easy to miss your fit on the toe and then lie about it by just rasping the toe back to, where it matches the shoe, and It still looks fairly good. But then working with one farrier in particular recently and seeing the way that those side clips were applied, and another one a year ago at convention, we had Jonathan Nunn, and seeing the way that he was applying them, it was quite different from what I had seen, and it worked well even on weak-footed horses. The method that he was using to apply them, where they were actually, instead of being set in completely flush with the hoof wall, which is still good practice on a healthy, thick-footed horse, but where they weren't driven or cut way deep into the hoof wall, they were laid on the outside without pressing or compressing the foot. So allowing that shoe to be placed correctly, but without restricting the movement of the foot. Just learning a lot about the correct application of things.
One of the takeaways that I had from today was what you had said about when you initially meet a client, just how you're both kind of establishing your rules and boundaries at that point. Could you touch on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first couple of times that you interact with a client, I think whether it's intentional or obvious or not, you're both testing each other.
Yeah.
So sometimes we don't realize it's happening. Sometimes it's very obvious, but whether we realize it or not, it's always happening the first couple of times. And you're both setting up the expectations for the other, for the near and possibly distant future. So they are going to expect a certain amount of you, and you're going to expect a certain amount of them. One example might be if they ask you to come out to fix a minor problem on, a Saturday night, something that can obviously wait until Monday morning, right?
I've never had one of those.
No, me neither. No, I'm sure none of us have. Yeah. But are you going to hop to it and go straight away and miss your, daughter's birthday party or whatever? Or are you going to say, you know what, there's something more important in my life? And the other side is true. If they have a big emergency on Monday morning and it's very important and you should really be there, are you going to say no or not, right? So it's a two-way street, but I think that initial period of time is a good time to set up the expectations to your clients as well, that yes, I'm here to service you the absolute best I can, but I also have boundaries as well. Mm-hmm. Setting up those boundaries, I think we tend to err because we do all want to please people, you know. I think we all probably tend to err maybe a little bit too much to the service side sometimes, but setting up those boundaries is important because it sounds strange, but it ultimately allows you to service your clients better. If you have a boundary, if you make sure that you have that time away and you're not always on call 24/7, you're able to jump back in and get to your work better, to do a better job, to be more available for people when there are real emergencies that come up, that sort of thing. So,
right. And this leads quite smoothly into my next question about now raising a family at the same time as running your own business. How do you find that balance? There must have been some decisions that you had to make to establish a balance, to be home, to raise your children, but also earn an income to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it really comes down to priorities. Yeah, at the end of the day, there are going to be a lot of situations where if you have a family, you have to choose between your family and work. And so you have to really sit down and think about where that line is and how much time your family is going to need and how much time your business is going to need, and understand that there are going to be exceptional circumstances for both, but for the most part, to learn to operate within those boundaries. So for myself, an example would be taking weekends off. I take weekends off at an absolute minimum. Sunday is always off, and I try to take Saturdays off with my family as well as I can. So I try not to work evenings or weekends. Right. Now, there are exceptions to that, but even in that, if I'm working a Saturday, summertime can be an exception to this, but if I'm working a Saturday, I'll often have at least, maybe a quarter day or even a half day earlier in the week that I can spend with my family.
Okay.
So I don't stress out about working the Saturday too much, Same thing with an evening. If I'm working an evening that day or even 3 days that week, but it means that I have a little bit more time later in the week, that works on a bigger scale too. Sometimes I know I have 2 busy weeks, but the 3 weeks following that are going to be a little bit more open, or the 2 weeks or even 1 week. Just making sure that those priorities in place. I love shoeing horses and I love even running a business most days. I know we all have those days, but most days I do. But ultimately, my family is more important to me than either of those things. So just making sure that that's the priority. And sometimes, thankfully not too often, but sometimes I have to tell my clients that.
Now, one of the main reasons that I wanted to have this conversation with you today was because of the talk that you gave last year at a clinic you hosted, where you gave a business talk, basically, and explained a lot of business concepts that some of us probably hadn't even considered before. I know some of the stuff was even new to me. So I thought we could share some of that with the audience today. So you started explaining that concept of the farrier who does several horses but charges less to do them. So they do numbers, but they charge less and they're making their money through quantity, versus the farrier who does fewer horses for more money. Could you start with that?
For sure. It is an interesting talk, even if you don't really like numbers. Yeah, like that analogy that you were giving, that example of two guys who, the one shoes more horses for less money, the other guy shoes less horses for more money. And in the analogy or the example that we used during that talk, they both end up at the end of the month making the exact same amount of money as a gross figure. And the question was asked, who makes more of a net profit? At the initial outset, we always tend to look at the gross numbers, right? Because those are the more impressive ones. Yeah. But the guy who's doing less horses is beating the pants off the other guy, right? His expenses are way down. His time is way down. His busyness is way down. His exasperation level, because he's servicing way less horses too, right? It's easy to get caught up doing numbers, especially if you have to sometimes in a certain area. Maybe the area won't allow for really, really high prices. So you can think, well, I'll just do a lot more numbers. But I think where a lot of us go wrong is we don't really take into consideration the baseline price for a horse. So Pat Broaddus has done a bunch of research on this, and if you convert the figures that he has given into Canadian funds, it works out to be between 140 and 160 bucks Canadian. That is what our cost is to shoe a horse.
Now, what would that be for the American listeners?
So the numbers he was given was kind of between 120 and $135 American at the time. Yeah. Even in a cheaper area, your prices should be set by your skill level, by your experience. And some people might not feel that they're worth, as much as others because they're maybe a little bit newer to the trade. And that may be true. But if you're only charging $160 to shoe a horse, then the only way you're making money is on your trims, really. Mm-hmm. So you're breaking even. Your trims are subsidizing your shoeing, right? Which is a horrible way to run a business. But just understanding where that baseline is, and that's going to be different for everyone. You have to sit down and kind of figure it out. But really, you only have to do that once, realistically, to give yourself a rough idea of what it's costing you, and just to understand that base level. It really is worth it to pay attention to that because it's good for us, first of all, right? If you're charging a fair price, you don't have to work an excessive amount just to make a living wage. Mm-hmm. But it's also good for your clients because if you're not shoeing an excessive amount, you're going to be able to better service the clients that you have as well. Exactly. So that's it in a nutshell.
Now, you also said today during one of our conversations that if you could work out just twice a year and be fit, we would all do that, and that it's worth looking into your finances maybe twice a year and figure out where you are and where you're going. Would you sit down with somebody, with a financial planner to do that, or is that something you do on your own?
There's two different strains of that. There's the personal finance and the business finance. In terms of the business, there's a lot of information that's already out there. Yes, if you were going to sit down, probably the first time especially, it'd be good to do with somebody who really knows the ins and outs of how a business works, especially if you're not well versed in it, especially if you don't have the capacity to run the numbers yourself, then definitely. Most of the horseshoers I know are really capable of running a lot of the basic numbers themselves. Like, I think the difficulty of it is not what holds most of us back. It's just doing it, really,
There's a bit of aversion to that.
Yeah. But just setting the course, if you think of your business as a boat, most of us could be driving on a better course.
Yeah.
And when you sit down and analyze those numbers, it's going to show you the course you're heading on. Maybe you're good with that. Maybe you can alter that course slightly by raising your prices or cutting out some of your worst clients or whatever it might be, right? But sometimes we can actually alter that course relatively easily. And once we're on that course, it takes a lot less upkeep to maintain that course. If only personal fitness was as simple.
As easy. To use another nautical analogy I've heard explained, you have to find the leaks in your canoe. And I know that's something that you have been pretty diligent about in finding the expenses. I guess we should start, for some people, maybe they wouldn't know this. What's the difference between net and gross?
Yeah, so your gross profit is the total amount that your business makes. So when you write a bill, the big number at the bottom, essentially less taxes. And that's the number that we all like to look at, right? Yeah.
Makes you feel good.
Yeah, exactly. So the net number is after all of your business expenses have been paid. That's your net profit. And that's the one that we really should be looking at a lot more. Both are important, but that's more what we get to take home. So after you paid for your supplies, your shoes, your nails, your rasps, your shoeing truck, etc., those are the numbers that are going to come up afterwards. So net is the profit after expenses.
So what are some of the leaks that you found that you corrected and have really changed the game for you?
So I looked at my profit and loss sheet at the end of the year, and I started with my biggest expense, which for me was vehicle expense. And so my trusty Rusty was getting more rusty than trusty. So it was time for a new vehicle. So I was telling you earlier today, I found the most fuel efficient vehicle that would do what I needed it to do.
And it's not a smart car.
Yeah, it's not a smart car, no, thankfully. So I run a Ford Transit Connect, which has worked very well for me. But then I also converted it to propane. So that it saves me approximately 50%. So it's half to run of what my half-ton pickup truck was. So that was a big leak that I managed to patch up. Again, I altered the direction that I was going. I altered the direction of my business. It cost a little bit more up front, but it took less than 2 years to pay off.
Right.
So I've had the van almost 3 years now, and we're in the clear in terms of paying that off. And from here on in, should be just slowing down leaks. So in terms of vehicle, other things, like I mentioned before, building shoes, right? Probably a smaller one, but that has other secondary benefits as well. But it is financially beneficial if you're smart about it. Yep. Some people like to spend money on tools, so I would caution you of that if you like to build shoes. But
I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, if you're going to build shoes to save money and then end up with $10,000 of anvils and hammers and just off the hop. It's funny how little things can save you money. Just like building hoof knives. It takes some investment in terms of time. But I had a few people show me how, and really it doesn't take long to become skilled. And when you become skilled, you make your time worth more money, right? So I told you this morning, approximately $10 in materials, right?
Yeah, for a knife.
Yeah, and about 20,
incredible.
Yeah, 20 minutes of time per knife when you do them in a batch, 15, 20 minutes. So really it's pretty good return on your money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all those things. I pretty much worked my way down the list and just looked at the biggest expenses and worked my way down. And the neat thing is that you can kind of build yourself a margin of safety as well. So if you think about if you were able to save half of your fuel bill, it's still important to schedule your clients in a way that's logistically efficient, right? To, string clients along the same day, do clients that are out in the same area. But if you're able to save half on your fuel bill, those things are still important. But really, if something goes wrong, it's not costing you an absolute bomb, because as much as we try to schedule those things together,
it doesn't always work.
It doesn't work as well. So it gives you a bit of a margin of safety when things do go wrong that way.
That's interesting. Now, I guess another benefit I noticed with your vehicle, you don't have a lot of outset costs in the inventory that you carry, because you've made shoes that are sitting on the shoe rack, but then you just have several lengths of concave that if you do have to build it at the horse, it's not like you have to keep several pairs of shoes that you might not ever use for 6 months or something before you need them again. You're probably carrying around a lot less weight than the average farrier too.
For sure, yeah. Even like a stocked up truck for me, or a stocked up shoe rack, is a maximum of 2 pairs in every size. So even then, often I just do fronts because I go through a lot more fronts than I do hinds. So for me, the hinds, they're pretty quick and easy to build. Even when I'm fully stocked up, that's in quotations, fully stocked up, it'll just be 1 pair of fronts on each size, and that's it. Yeah. Okay. And then a few pads, just the basics. Although having said that, like I carry pads, I carry impression material, and I also carry a glue kit. Those are kind of tucked away. I feel that even though the van is a lot smaller, I don't think there's any compromise in it. I still have a full-size grinder. There's not things where it's really costing me a lot of time or anything like that.
Right.
Full-size grinder, full-size drill presses. Yeah, I don't feel there's any compromise with it. I don't think there's any situation where I pull up and I think, I got to go to the supply store or whatever. Like, I might not carry much at a time, but I do carry enough of pads and glue and whatever I would need, that pretty much any situation that I have the skills to deal with, I'll be able to deal with it.
And that is probably a key component right there where you said skills, because you've spent years building those up so that you can build something if you need to at the horse. So that's almost saving you inventory right there.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, the better you get with that, the less you need, right? It's one of those funny things. We tend to think the better a horseshoer you are, the bigger truck you need to carry all your stuff. But the opposite is sometimes true, right? So
yeah, Chris said his kept getting smaller and smaller as he became a better shoer. I know when you gave the talk, you shared some more money-saving tips for us. What are some other things that you recommend or that you've changed yourself?
It's going to be different for every person. I think everybody should just look at your own list of expenses. Get your bookkeeper, or if you are your bookkeeper, then that should cut out a step. But yeah, just look at your list of expenses and just see where the biggest holes are in your canoe, and just start with that. Yeah. But be willing to shop around for things like insurance, for things like your phone plan, and those monthly costs, especially, you put effort into it one time and it continues saving you every month almost indefinitely, right? So those are really good bang for your buck. But yeah, really just start at the top of the list and work your way down. If you're not sure how to save money on something, there's somebody out there who has. You can think you run the most efficient business, and there's somebody out there who's doing better than you are, and they're being very creative about it, right? So there's a lot of good ideas out there. So talk to other people and don't be penny wise, pound foolish. Start at the biggest expenses and work your way down.
Go down. Now, you mentioned that you actually have listened to quite a few podcasts on investing and financial stuff along those lines. Are there any that you would recommend?
There's one called The Investors Podcast, so it's easy to remember. That one's good. That's all around. I would say that one's probably one of the easiest ones to understand and listen to.
So something I thought of to ask you after our conversation about work-life balance, when somebody comes to you as a potential new customer, how do you approach taking them on, especially if you're already, like say in the summer, very busy? How does that work? Do you turn them down or do you work them into your schedule somehow? What's your take on that?
So if possible, I try never to turn anyone down. I try to always be able to accept new clients. And over time, I've intentionally tried to keep myself from becoming excessively busy. In the summertime, it's a little more sketchy. I think, I don't shoot tons and tons of horses, but even so, things go a little crazy sometimes. But thankfully, because I'm not terribly busy, I usually have time to be able to accommodate a new client. And so I'll fit them in. If I can, I will do my best to evaluate, over a couple of cycles, how much we like each other. And sometimes you get these clients and they are just gems and you love them and they love you and, it's all wonderful.
Yeah.
And they're few and far between, but sometimes you come across those people, right? And so if you use the 3-point grading system, do they pay you? Do they have good horses? And are they close to home? And so using those things and weighting them relatively equally, you can figure out that's a big part of how good of a client is this going to be for me, especially in terms of efficiency. So if I get a new client, and especially if they're close to home, that's going to be better for me than a client that's far away.
For sure.
And if I have a client with, maybe they're a little bit further away, but they have a bunch of really well-behaved horses, that's going to be better for me than a client that's maybe a little closer to home, but has a few rank horses, right?
Yeah.
So just weighing those things of how good of a client is this going to be, and ultimately using a new client to make my business more efficient. So if I get a client and it's right in the middle of a bunch of other clients that I do out that day and I can just slot them in, then that's great. And ultimately, if I can start working my business closer to home or even just into more efficient days, then that's wonderful. So for that reason, I wouldn't turn anyone down. Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever run into a situation where a client or a vet insists that you do something that you feel goes against everything you believe in as far as your principles of farriery?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I will tell a story about an aluminum shoe. So I had a horse that came in and it was one of my horses that had gone away for training for a couple of months and it came back and it was wearing side-clipped aluminum shoes. And just the nature of the shape of the foot and everything, I really felt it would do well in a toe-clip shoe. So being who I am, I handmade it, what I thought was a decent pair of, toe-clipped aluminum shoes. And I took pictures and everything. I was really proud of myself. And I was on my way home and I got a call from the trainer and they said, well, this horse can't be in toe clips. I was like, oh, shoot. Why not? And there was no real reason except that was the trainer's preference. Well, of course, after you've just been sweating over a pair of shoes, that's not the time to tell somebody that, that's not when we want to hear that they don't want toe clips on that horse. So
you're pretty attached to them.
That's right. Point. Yeah. Anyway, I eventually conceded. After going home and stewing about it a little bit, I conceded within myself that it wasn't going to harm the horse to put side clips on. So I did that the next cycle. There have been much worse situations than that in terms of being asked to do things that I thought were downright wrong or just really ridiculous, especially the ridiculous ones. That's been a bit of a learning curve for me. I think in the beginning, I was so concerned with well, that's not correct. That's not, and my brain just couldn't get over that I think I probably was a little snarkier than I should have been, and I don't think that was good. I would say that I've learned over time that, and try to be able to accommodate people, even if I think they're ridiculous, as long as it's not going to harm the horse. Yeah. And that's what I kind of use as a metric. So if I do feel that it's going to harm the horse, even then I try to be diplomatic and try to explain my viewpoint. But I have had times where I've had to say, I can't do that in good conscience. So you're going to have to find somebody else if that's the only route that you feel we can go. And that's a very tough thing to say.
No kidding.
Yeah. And thankfully, it's only those times have been few and far between. But even so, it's better if that's the only reason that you're disagreeing is because you feel it is actually going to be harmful to the horse. I feel that there is a lot of middle ground where, we might feel it's ridiculous, but you never know. It might work too. You have to be careful about doing things that are completely outside your comfort level. But again, just evaluate your own motivations. Why are you uncomfortable with that? Is it just because you're uncomfortable with it or you don't like it or you think it's annoying or whatever, right? But I've learned over time to really examine my own motivations and see why I don't like the suggestion. And a lot of times it just comes down to me being just annoyed that somebody, suggested something that I thought was ridiculous. And, that's not a very good reason, is it? So that's the honest answer.
Yeah, that's pretty good advice, though.
Yeah. So there's one more point on that aluminum shoe story. I just wanted to add that it's just very ironic because the reason that I got hired into that barn in the first place was because one of my horses came there for training in an aluminum toe clip shoe. And they looked at it, and the owner of the barn said, well, we looked at that horse and we thought you did a very nice job. And we wonder if you'd like to start shoeing some of our horses. And so as I was driving home, I thought, boy, it'd be really ironic if I got fired from this barn for the exact same reason that I got hired to it.
For the same shoeing job.
Yeah.
Incredible. What advice would you give somebody starting out as an apprentice in this line of work?
I would say choose your mentors wisely. I would say spend time working with other farriers. This is one of the biggest ones that I probably didn't do nearly enough of. And I'm still doing it now, partly because I didn't do it enough when I was starting out. But we have a lot of really talented farriers. Anywhere you go, every area has very talented farriers for the most part. Many of these guys, they will fly places. You'll pay hundreds of dollars to go to a clinic. You can go work for them for free, and it'll be one-on-one for 8 hours, and they will most likely be happy to tell you stuff. And it's amazing. You get a free clinic, and it's one-on-one. So I don't know why we don't do this more, but that's the biggest thing I would say. It's tough when you're starting out because you do need to make money, but that is a really good investment, and it's never going to be easier to do that than when you're starting out and don't have a full-time business yet.
Right. And then how about somebody 5 or 10 years in?
Don't get complacent. Don't cruise. Yeah. That's a time, 5 years, 10 years, when you've probably got a decent amount of skill at that point in time. So it can really become easy to start just to put it on cruise control. Keep going to clinics because sometimes you have to almost achieve a basic level of skill before you can really start learning, Mm-hmm. We think that we learn basic, how to trim and how to fit in that first 5 years. But really, if we're being honest, most of us aren't very good at it at 5 years or even 10 years. So sometimes at 5 or 10 years, you've got some of the kind of basic skills. You're good at holding the feet. You're good at using your tools at that point in time. Sometimes it's not until then that we actually learn how to trim and shape. I think most of us hate to admit that we're not very good at it, but if we're honest, a lot of the basic skills still need development for a long time. So don't think that you're amazing at those basic skills at the outset or at 5 or 10 years down the road. Continue that improvement even on those basic skills.
Yeah, you can always improve, I think. We were having a conversation at lunch today where I had asked you if you had a similar experience where once you get to a certain point, you have all this foundational knowledge and then you actually start coming up with concepts or techniques or modifications on your own that you might not have ever seen before, but they're an accumulation of several things that you've probably brought together. You used a pretty interesting metaphor for that. Could you just explain that?
Yeah, so you have all these kind of building blocks that you learn, right? And most of them are foundational. So if you become good at trimming the feet, your trim is very good and solid. You become good at shaping, forging. And we have all these different things over time. You maybe add in how to glue feet, how to use pour-in pads. Sometimes you encounter a situation where none of the skills that you've been taught are going to work in and of themselves, but you can stand on those building blocks and reach for another option, which is a combination of some of the other basic skills that you've used. So being adaptive and being flexible, so taking those building blocks and creating something else out of them, being adaptive and flexible with what you have to make a new option. I was saying to you as well that Leo was really good at that. He would take a little bit from this building block and a little bit from that building block, and he would combine methods and make something new that I'd never seen him do before, just to suit the needs of that particular horse. So that's a very interesting thing when that starts to happen. I would say for me, it was probably at least 5 years in before I really noticed that starting to happen, the innovation, because it does take a mastery of the basic skills, I think, or at least being proficient in them to where you can then adapt them into something new a specific situation requires.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. We'll move from this on to the stratum tectorium, the short answer questions. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
This portion of the podcast is called the stratum tectorium. These are the short answer, surface stuff questions, but it's okay if the guest wants to go deeper. The stratum tectorium is the outermost layer of the hoof wall. The thin layer of cells, also known as the hoof varnish or the stratum externum. Maybe you just learned a new word. I hope you learned some interesting facts about our guest too. Enjoy. Your favorite book most gifted to others?
That's probably two different answers. I think my favorite book is the Bible. The book most gifted to others is a book called The Automatic Millionaire by David Bach. So a personal finance book.
Okay, I'll look that one up. Your favorite make of rasp?
I like the Heller XL Legend.
I just saw you using that today. Seems to be a fairly common one.
It does,
with most of the people I've spoken to.
Yeah.
What is your dream farrier rig?
A 2012 Ford Transit Connect with a propane conversion.
Your favorite rounding hammer?
I like Derek Gardner's a lot. I also have one that I made, it's similar to Derek.
Favorite type of bar stock to work with?
3/8/7/8 concave.
Gas or diesel truck?
Gas. Propane, if that's an option.
Yeah, I should have made that an option.
Yeah.
You're causing me to delve into new territory. Favorite pastime after work?
We bought a project property, and so that's what I work on primarily after work. So just cleaning up the ground, and we were fixing up the house, but yeah, a lot of work to do around here. So
Oh, okay.
I also play a bit of guitar and
Oh, do you?
yeah,
Okay.
bit of piano too as well. Yeah, just don't ask me to sing. So.
Okay. I heard one of your children earlier. I think you've got a singer.
Better than me.
Next thing on your bucket list?
The next thing on my bucket list, I have a writing project I'm working on. And so I'm hoping to finish that up eventually. Yeah, and then after that, I'm hoping to eventually tackle the AWCF. So
Cool.
yeah,
Hopefully we can practice for that together.
hopefully. Yeah, that'd be great.
Favorite brand of keg shoe if you had to use one?
I like the Workmans. I've been pretty impressed with them.
Leather or synthetic pads?
Leather. Yeah, definitely.
And why?
I find that leather does a lot less damage to the foot. It gives some good cushion. There seems to be less bacteria for some reason. Maybe that's just personal observation, and I'm just sure that's highly speculative. But yeah, I find, especially in terms of crushed heels, leather's just a lot easier on the foot.
Favorite type of horse to work on?
Anything that stands well.
Seems to be the universal answer. Ideal number of horses to shoe all around in one day?
Boy, 4, even 3, if I could get away with it.
Yep.
I would say probably 3 complex horses would be my ideal day. You know those horses that take you 2 hours? They're challenging but rewarding.
Yep.
That'd be ideal, yeah.
Your favorite anvil?
I like the Coleslaws. They're nice. I don't have one, but that would be my favorite if I had one.
Right.
Yeah.
What wood do you prefer to use for your hammer handles?
Hickory's pretty good.
And do you wrap them?
I do not, although I haven't gone to the dark side of wrapping yet, but I might. I hear so many good things about it. So
Yeah, I just joined the dark side. What brand of accounting software do you use, or do you go straight to paper?
yeah, I use paper.
Okay. Paper invoices as well?
Paper invoices as well, yeah. Although I would like to transfer to digital for invoicing. But yeah, in terms of scheduling, it's paper all the way, yeah.
Preferred social media platform?
I would say Facebook if you pressed me, although I don't have a solid favorite. I'm becoming less impressed with social media over time. So yeah.
I feel that.
Yeah.
What brand of phone do you use?
I use an Apple iPhone 6s.
Do you have injury insurance?
In a manner of speaking, this was something that I kind of got from Leo a little bit. I've heard some reasonable quotes in recent years for injury insurance, but all the times that I have looked into getting it, it was quite expensive. Once they hear that you're working with 1,200-pound animals and fire, there's something about that. I'm not sure what it is. But so what I do is I have a large emergency fund that would basically pay for 6 months of expenses, or in a real pinch, I could stretch it out to a year between that and rental income. Okay. And so the hope is that in that time, I would be able to sort things out and either retrain myself to do something else if I were injured badly enough, or so it is probably shorter term, possibly, but over time, and especially, like I say, I own a rental house, so that would be providing some income too. So there'd be some options there. Yeah.
Favorite method of soothing aches and pains?
I have this cream that a client gave me, and it's phenomenal. It's called Pot of Gold. It's all natural. It works really well. I would say, unfortunately, the most effective method of soothing aches and pains is shoeing more horses.
Really?
Yeah. The amount of times I've gone to work with a sore back and come home actually feeling better than when I left, it's unfortunate.
Or maybe fortunate.
Yeah. Leo would always say, after a while, your body begins to crave the abuse. So, I think that's true.
I think you might be right.
Yeah.
He might be right. Favorite brand of jeans?
I can't say I have a favorite per se. No.
Okay.
Yeah, whatever works.
Favorite genre of music?
I like a whole variety. It'd probably be quicker to tell you what I don't like than what I do like. So, yeah, a whole variety, really.
Do you work out?
I don't know if you could quite classify it as working out. Every morning I have a half-hour regime, so I do a lot of stretching. I do some push-ups and core exercises and those sorts of things. So,
Okay. Do you meditate?
just pray.
And what would you have been if not a farrier?
Probably a land surveyor or an engineer, I think.
And I guess one more I should add to this and probably add to future podcasts. I was thinking about it today. What configuration of knives do you use? Because everybody seems to have a different technique for knifing out feet, like a loop knife, left-handed, right-handed.
Yeah,
What do you
so
use?
I am left-handed, so I carry a loop knife and I carry a left-handed drop blade knife. So I use the loop knife only on the frog and try to keep it as sharp as I can. And I use the left-handed drop blade for the sole work and that sort of thing. So I make my own hoof knives. I find that you can really get the handle spot on when you make them yourself, right? So yeah,
You have no one to blame but yourself if you
Yeah,
don't. Yeah.
that's true enough. Yeah,
Okay. Well, and that's it. Well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Yeah,
This has
my
been
pleasure.
a great day.
yeah, that's
Thank
been
you.
a lot of fun.
If you would like to learn more from Andrew about running the business end of a farrier practice, he's actually going to be giving a talk at the Ontario Farriers Convention this year. That will be held between Thursday, September the 26th, until the Saturday, September the 28th, 2019, at the Orangeville Fairgrounds in Ontario, Canada. Andrew's talk will be on the Friday afternoon, and another one of our former guests on the podcast here, Dr. Andrew Dubé, will actually be giving a talk on the Saturday afternoon. I'm also excited to announce that Barney Cummings has graciously offered to do an interview with me live at the convention. We will record it there. There will be questions from the audience. This will be the first time that we're trying it in this format, so I'm very excited. Barney is going to give a talk on running a multi-farrier practice in Canada. He's one of the first to do that, and he has a lot of wisdom to share. The board of the Ontario Farriers Association worked really hard this year to put together quite the convention. There are multiple clinicians, lots of modules. There is going to be a lot of information to garner from this particular convention. If you find yourself with some time at the end of this week, I hope to see you there. Until next time, thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other out there.